You're listening to Aanoodizewin, a podcast about the commercial determinants of Indigenous health. I am Bidasi Kwe Nimki Beneshi Dodem Wikwem Kong Donjaba Nogo Jawani Doda. I am Dr. Amy Shawanda. I'm a provost postdoctoral fellow at the Wakabenes Institute for Indigenous Health at the University of Toronto.
My name is Daniel Eisenkraft Klein. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto.
And in each episode, we sit down with experts to talk about a different health-harming industry and how it intertwines with the legacies of colonization and Indigenous health.
Today's topic is opioids. Most of you likely already know something about opioids. You've read stories about the downtown east side in Vancouver, seen newspaper headlines about the toll of the opioid crisis, or maybe you've seen the latest news about another settlement with one of the opioid manufacturers. And to be frank, the number of opioid-related deaths in Canada is staggering. We had about 7,000 people die from an opioid poisoning last year, which is about 20 people every day. And there's little sense that's gotten any better in 2023. But something that can get lost in the constant coverage is the hugely disproportionate burden that the opioid crisis places on Indigenous communities. In British Columbia, for instance, despite representing just 2.6% of the total population, Indigenous peoples account for 10% of overdose deaths. A lot of this also got worse during the pandemic. Opioid-related deaths increased sharply among rural Indigenous people during the pandemic in particular, almost doubling after March 2020. And all of this affects younger people the most, with those under 44 most impacted. And my sense, Amy, is Indigenous leaders have been warning about the burden of health crises on their communities for some time now.
Yeah, I think that's right. Many of the gaps in the public health system that led to this crisis have been noted in previous federal level reports. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls, or the TRC, calls to action 18 through 24 direct governments to effect change within the Canadian healthcare system and address the distinct health needs of off-reserve First Nations people. And the Calls for Justice 3.4 from the final report from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls seeks to ensure that all Indigenous communities receive immediate and necessary resources, including funding and support for the establishment of sustainable, permanent, no-barrier, preventative, accessible, holistic, wraparound services, including mobile trauma and addictions recovery teams.
Right, so Indigenous communities really have been ringing the alarm for a long time about this and the potential for things like this to happen. Now, there's been very little research on how the opioid industry's actions have disproportionately impacted Indigenous communities. Instead, we really have these isolated pieces of information. We know about the opioid industry's efforts. We know that Indigenous peoples are disproportionately impacted by the opioid crisis.
And so while we start today's conversation about the industry's role in the crisis, it really does turn into a bigger discussion about how the opioid crisis is impacting Indigenous communities more generally. The industry fueled the crisis, but that fuel intersected with the legacy of colonization, the failed war on drugs, and increasingly poisoned drug supply, and the broader inadequate investment in Indigenous communities. So most of today's conversation is actually about responses to the opioid crisis by Indigenous communities, particularly those driven by Indigenous communities. It's a slight departure from our other episodes, but an important one. We welcome to the podcast two Ariels, Ariel Richard and Ariel Roddy. Before we get started, I'll let you two introduce yourselves.
So I am Ariel Richard. I'm Afro-Indigenous and white. I'm descendant of the Carib Indians of Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela on my mom's side, and I am white, English, Canadian on my dad's side. I just always describe myself as a community-based decolonial researcher. I just earned my PhD in social work from Columbia University School of Social Work this May, and I begin as an assistant professor at the University of Utah College of Social Work in July. Broadly, I study drug, sex, and violence, and I work with communities to build culturally tailored interventions and programs that address the intersection of substance use, partner violence, and HIV, and sexually transmitted infections. And I've mainly worked with Black and Indigenous communities, people involved in the criminal legal system, either through probation or parole, and queer communities.
My name is Ariel Roddy. I am Sault Ste. Marie Ojibwe and white as well. I recently accepted a position at Northern Arizona University, where I will be an assistant professor in criminology and criminal justice. I see myself as an Indigenous feminist researcher. I work closely with community partners to try and establish what the relationship is between colonialism, experiences of victimization, as well as experiences of substance use and substance use disorder.
Thank you, and so happy to have you both here. Prescription opioids is also one of Daniel's main areas of research, so he'll actually serve as both a guest and a co-host today. We know Daniel from our previous episode, so let's just jump right into it. Daniel, can you tell us a bit about the opioid industry's influence in Canada?
Sure. So let's start by stating what most of you already know. Generally, we separate opioids as illicit or legal. The illicit market, which is increasingly dominated by fentanyl in Canada, makes up the majority of the opioid-related poisonings at this point. Really, opioid prescriptions started growing in Canada in the early 1980s, but that growth exploded by the 1990s and with the introduction of Purdue Pharma's OxyContin. And we should note here, when you hear expanded, we're not talking about a 50% increase or even a 100% increase. If you measure the volume of prescription opioids sold to hospitals and pharmacies in Canada, it actually increased by more than 3,000% between 1982 and 2016. And in 2016, which was really the peak of opioid prescribing in Canada, we had over 20 million prescriptions for opioids dispensed, which is equivalent to about one prescription for every adult in Canada. And so overall, that actually made Canada the second largest consumer of prescription opioids in the world after the United States. So this crisis was fueled by an industry that heavily marketed the products really across the healthcare system. And throughout, you see the industry minimizing risks of addiction and opposing any regulations that eat into their profits. So in tandem with these factors, an industry, in particular, but not only Purdue Pharma, took on a sustained strategy to market and aggressively promote opioids as a first-line defense for people with a range of pain conditions. Can you talk a bit about the impacts of the opioid crisis specifically on Indigenous communities, and how do those impacts differ from other communities' experiences with the crisis? Can you speak a bit about that?
Sure. So, Ariel, Roddy, I'll start. So before we get fully started, I just want to emphasize that I'm going to be aware of maybe past pitfalls in this area, and I want to highlight resiliency as much as possible. Ariel, is there anything else you want to add to that?
Yes, thank you for helping us frame this conversation. Something that I've been talking about a lot with some of your research assistants and colleagues has been that as a researcher, we can share things that are true or factual, but without context, they can still perpetuate racism. So, for example, you can say, this group disproportionately experiences some social phenomenon like drug use or violence, and it's true, but without context, it adds to pathologizing that phenomenon and making an individual failing instead of a response to oppressive systems, structures, and just external circumstances, mainly settler colonialism, forced relocation, theft of land, culture, the list goes on, and just to everyday erasure. So it really sets the tone for how and why there may be worse outcomes. And I think it's honestly unethical and irresponsible of researchers and social scientists. And frankly, it can be racist if we're not setting up that context.
And part of a broader movement in health research, public health research, to talk about racism instead of race, or to specifically identify racism instead of race.
So as many of us know, certainly on this podcast, but hopefully people in the general public are also aware. So Indigenous peoples in the US and Canada are really unique in their experiences of colonialism and specifically settler colonialism. And the opioid crisis in particular for Indigenous communities reflects the contemporary as well as the intergenerational experiences of trauma for Indigenous people. So uniquely, we see that rates of overdose for Indigenous populations are higher than other groups. So opioid-related deaths have increased 5 times between 1999 and 2015 in Indigenous populations across the US and Canada. And from an intersectional standpoint, which is mostly where my work sits, Indigenous women are also especially affected. So they're 8 times more likely to have a non-fatal overdose and 5 times more likely to have a fatal overdose than non-Indigenous women. And frankly, we understand that the severity of this crisis is likely understated in many settings, and in many ways, the figures kind of undercount Indigenous opioid fatality. I've seen figures as high as 35% just due to racial misclassification on death certificates, which is yet again a product of colonialism, right? So we kind of see the ways in which colonialism kind of interweaves throughout the opioid crisis, making these the specific issue so salient for Indigenous populations. We also see that in part opioid use fatality is driven by increased access to prescription opiates, especially with young Indigenous people. So young Indigenous young adults are at a higher risk of utilizing prescription drugs, with approximately 1 in 10 young people under the age of 12 reporting using prescription painkillers for non-medical reasons, compared to 1 in 20 for white youth and 1 in 30 for Black youth. So there's a notable disparity too when it comes to the youth that are also experiencing kind of the medicalization of colonialism as well. But I imagine this is what we're going to be covering later in the podcast, and what I think this is where we start to integrate Ariel and I's work, is that there have been some really incredible efforts by and for Indigenous people in North America to address the crisis. And that's mostly, where we like to study, is thinking about the effects of culturally adaptive, culturally responsive treatment that is governed by Indigenous communities themselves. And that's the direction that our research, I think, is going to continue to move in the future, to highlight the resiliency and highlight the efforts done by Indigenous people to solve this problem in the absence kind of support from the structures that exist currently.
Well, on that note, when we're talking about culturally tailored interventions for substance use, and I know you've both written on this, can you speak about that? How that could be applied to approaching the overdose crisis? Do you have some specific examples to build from? I think one of the goals of this podcast is not only to make it relevant for researchers and the general public, but also for people making policy decisions, looking for sort of concrete examples. So specific places where, or settings where this has been applied would be really useful.
Yeah, of course. This is really the crux of our work, and has been the first 2 ways that Ariel and I have collaborated, and some of our first publications, and even thinking through the terminology of culturally adapted, culturally responsive, culturally tailored. There's a lot of words floating around there. And there are some nuances in the differences of these terms, but what I really think it comes down to, or is coming from a place that the development of interventions, programs, treatments have not traditionally involved Indigenous people. They're not tested or piloted with these groups or communities in mind. And so, our cultures and languages and needs and unique histories are not considered in the development of them. So I don't think it's that surprising that maybe a cookie cutter approach is not going to work and is not going to be effective. So there were a couple of things that we highlighted in one of our commentaries that just like broadly was that interventions that are mirroring or just very similar to the values and power dynamics that we see in settler colonial state. So again, coming back to this as kind of like framing the conversation, that they're going to be inadequate. They're not going to be able to address systemic harm. Another thing that we've really focused on is that interventions need to reflect the values and traditions of each of the individual communities, so that you can really facilitate healing and recovery, and really focusing on that. Many Indigenous people view learning, speaking your language, your Indigenous language, accessing and using traditional medicines as not only treatment, but as a preventative tool in substance use. So like culture as prevention, culture as healing. And then one thing that I'm realizing now didn't make it into that first paper, which I'm really glad that I can have an addendum now through this, is that the tailoring really has to start at the beginning. So, people with lived experience, people who use drugs, Indigenous people who use drugs, so that intersection there, who are involved in the development of programs, and then meaningfully ensuring that they are compensated for their involvement, that they're not just invited to the table, but what they say actually has impact, actually is going to change how things are happening, change the process of the programming and the treatment. So there are two programs that we highlighted and have found to be really exemplary, not to mention that there aren't many more. I think one of the limitations of doing a systematic review or doing a review of peer-reviewed or academic journal work is that you're only going to be seeing work that is often federally funded, that is led by somebody who has a PhD, that has then been peer-reviewed by other people who have PhDs. So all these barriers to access, being able to do that research and then publish it, and then they're only available in paid journals. So then interventionists and practitioners and community members can't even access it. That's my little aside about the work, but we did try to do a search for things that were outside of just being published in academic journals and really seeing what was there at the community level. And the Penobscot Indian Nation, located just outside of Bangor, Maine, they have a tribal health to wellness court, which integrates substance use treatment with the criminal justice system through transitional services with a focus on non-punitive settings. And they're guided by these 10 key components that invite people to look up outside of this. But basically, this court was launched in 2008 and has been particularly successful. It's similar to other drug courts. Like, that's not a new phenomenon or new way of addressing substance use. But there's intensive case management, there's counseling, regular drug testing, there's a system of rewards and consequences. But where we start seeing this cultural tailoring is in the way that they approach 4 phases of treatment and wellness. And they're named, and even from the way that they're named after 4 traditional medicines: tobacco, cedar, sage, and sweetgrass. And again, Native communities, Indigenous communities are not a monolith, but there are some overarching things that weave us together. And a lot of these traditional medicines have particular significance, and they may mean something different in each community, but overall they are understood to be very important. So I did want to focus that, so for this program, tobacco is associated with phase 1, and it means introducing new beginnings. Phase 2 is cedar, and that confronts personal responsibility. So the personal responsibility of drug use and substance abuse and what may come after that. Phase 3 is represented by sage and invites cooperation and accountability. And finally, phase 4 is sweetgrass, which brings completion and continued growth and wellness. And throughout this program, we're seeing participants can expect prayer and smudging of traditional medicines in each session. And they have access to drumming circles if it makes sense for their community. And language classes are just 2 examples of cultural events that are offered. And all along the way, you see individual and community wellness are equally important, because those things can't be separated. And that's definitely in response to what we see in a settler colonial state, that everything's individualistic, that this is your fault, a personal failing, and really puts the onus on them. But for this, it is between individual and community. I do have one more example if there's time, but I also want to invite others to ask questions, anything that's coming up for either of you.
So I have additional things to say. I think Ariel is saying everything perfectly. And I think I can't speak for Ariel and why she kind of entered this work. But as she was kind of speaking about the importance of like culturally tailored or culturally responsive methods of treatment. I remember the first time that I was able to like sit in on like a recovery, to be inside of a recovery space, right? So I knew that this was like a type of work that I was interested in doing. And so I found the opportunity to be able to be present in a meeting. And it was an NA meeting. And when I looked around the room, of course, like it was a predominantly white audience, and I kind of thought through the 12 steps process. And just to kind of speak to the point that Ariel was making before, there were just like so many elements in which we were kind of reifying like this weird colonial hierarchy. And it works for many people. And I think that that's great. I think that there are people I know who would say that 12 steps saved them. And I think it is important for people to have access to that. But the issue comes in when that's the only type of service that is provided in a particular place or in a particular setting, right? And so I hear kind of the echoes of like colonialism kind of in the messaging, in kind of the way that like drugs and opiates especially are talked about. And so I feel very much like these efforts by these Indigenous communities are not only just like radical, but they are anti-colonial. And I just find it so cool that there are these efforts that are happening that are actively pushing back against these systems of power that have existed kind of ever since, the initial the initial process of colonization. So that's all I wanted to add. Ariel, you're doing great. So thanks.
Thank you. That actually reminded me of, if we're trying to talk about tangible steps and how to even start in this, because again, I just gave an example of, I presented a program kind of with a nice, neat bow of how it's put together. But then there's this question of, well, how do you start in this work? How are you developing these programs? The way that I weave all of my many different type of work together is in access and use of services, and what are the barriers and what are the facilitators? Like, how are people able to even get into something or, walk into an office? And then how are they going to stay to get services? And the way that people engage with Indigenous folks has to start from that very first person they're seeing, from maybe a first pamphlet that they're seeing, how they're understanding the program, from the person at the front desk, all the staff you're coming in contact with, because each of those people are points that could drive somebody away or invite them to stay and want to be there, and it be a healing space and not further traumatize, because there is so much mistrust and distrust of medical models, medical offices, anything that is associated with a system because of our Indigenous histories and how these services that are meant to be healing for other people have been so traumatic and a way to further dispossess us of our land, of our culture, of being in community with our families. So as I started off this conversation, that you need to have people with lived experiences building and talking about these programs and in the development, but you also need to have Indigenous social workers along the way, and just infusing this all along the way, especially as I think about, so my work is often with urban living Indigenous and Native people. I forgot to mention earlier that I also run a nonprofit in New York City that focuses on the health and mental health of urban living Indigenous people in the New York City tri-state area. So New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, a little bit of Pennsylvania. And it is very different than rural or reservation based, because you're seeing people from a multitude of nations. You're seeing people like myself who are not native to North America, but my people come from South America. So you're seeing more of a global Indigenous, a little bit more like pan-Indigenous. So it does make it a little bit harder to tailor because you don't have one specific community that you are tailoring to. But some things that are overarching and weave through all the communities are, connection to land, language, other non-human relatives like plants and animals, and just the world around you. And like that is pretty common across all Indigenous communities. So that's another thing I needed to make sure that was in there, because we have a majority, at least in what the so-called US, that over 71% of Indigenous identified people are living in non-rural areas, so in either in urban or like cities. And New York City has the most amount of Indigenous people, around like 115, 120,000 based on the last census.
One thing that strikes me when you're talking about the program, you mentioned that these are in some ways radical. In other ways, it seems like they're pairing these classic approaches to substance or mental health use through intensive case management, regular drug testing, with some pretty standard practices around traditional medicines and around Indigenous communities. A lot of what you're talking about, it seems like, is burning sage, gifting tobacco, there's drum circles, there's smudging. On one hand, it sounds radical. On the other, it seems like these are like, you would not have to be that radical to figure out that these common traditional practices in Indigenous communities need to be paired with, if you're going to bring in those classic approaches to substance use that in this case are done across Maine.
So what you're saying is we have and always know how to serve and help our people?
Well, not only that, but like the idea, the term radical is, I understand it's radical in the context of what policy has been, but it doesn't seem radical in terms of like even thinking that radically outside the box, right?
Yes. Yeah. So it's so many points you can tailor. So this is kind of that first thing that I was talking about a little bit earlier, that tailoring, culturally responsive, culturally developed, that this is an example of, something that's already existed. And there's also funding around tribal courts. I also serve as a community reviewer who reviews federal grants. So I often see these types of programs suggested, or people responding to solicitations and trying to set up their own or get funding for them. So it is and isn't radical, because so many times these solicitations didn't even allow you to add in these other cultural aspects or things that are so very much important. And we are starting to see a shift in what is allowed and what is acceptable in funding. And then we're also seeing funding streams, at least in the US, I can't speak to Canada, but that are Native community focused. So you'll see, one funding announcement, and there'll be a program area that is specifically for Native and is much more open about the activities and the goals and the objectives and what can actually happen in those, specifically in drug courts. I just finished reading 13 applications about people talking about what they were proposing, and none of these were Native focused.
And if I can add too, I mean, I think, at least coming from the field that I'm in. So Ariel's in the field of social work. I'm in the field of criminal justice and criminology. And especially when we think about adjustments to our criminal justice system, I mean, the way our criminal justice system exists right now is just so draconian, for lack of a better word. There's a ton of pushback when it comes to like creating adjustments or improvements for anyone in a criminal justice system, because people start to perceive that as being, soft on crime, or like it's going to incentivize people to place themselves in situations that they want to be incarcerated or involved in the criminal justice system for some reason, or at least that seems to be kind of the predominant narrative that we hear in the United States. And it's fairly embarrassing, frankly. And so when I think about too, like just even these small fine-tune adjustments to the way that drug courts are run, or even like giving individuals who are incarcerated, Indigenous individuals who are incarcerated, access to ceremony, right? All of these things are pushed back against as being improvements that are going to benefit a group of people that we feel as a society very little sympathy for, right? So even though it doesn't necessarily seem particularly radical, and I agree, when I think of radical adjustments to the criminal justice system, my first thought isn't, well, we should start to, like build in better cultural practices while we also continue to like punish people for things that are beyond their control. These small adjustments can make a large difference. And I think it helps us kind of start to see the ways in which we can further start to expand our conception of what justice looks like for Indigenous people, given the context that we're currently in, right? So just to build off of that thought, I don't believe that it is particularly radical from like our standpoint today, but I think that when we think about the adjustments that need to be made in the criminal justice system, the fact that we're focusing on like incorporating these ideas of indigeneity at all is kind of pushing us in a more radical direction. And I'm hopeful that eventually we can start to see broader changes that further address the idea of settler colonialism and how it builds into our criminal justice system today. But it's to me, it's at least in some ways heartening. And it also, because these programs are generally so successful, it's very difficult for there to be pushback against them because they have been shown to have much more beneficial outcomes for Indigenous people, which if that is the goal, then they are achieving that for sure.
These are such interesting points coming in from the States. Like I grew up in Northern Ontario, and I've been really fortunate that my First Nation, we not only have the capacity, I mean, I feel like there's always room for improvement, but where we are situated and the way I was raised with all of these programs, like I know we have a methadone clinic in our First Nation, and that is to keep the people in with their families instead of shipping them off and them coming back. We also have treatment centers that are land-based and they're on the island, or you can go to like any different one. And I really like how these models are changing, but they're not everywhere yet. And they're still trying to get that funding going and really maintain and really expand these, because I know on Manitoulin, where I'm from, they have a recovery place and it's land-based, and they bring in social workers and they bring in nurses. And when people are having those withdrawal symptoms and need that help, they're there. And that may seem radical to a lot of people, because I'm like, well, we've been doing that. Like we've been taking care of our own already. Like, is this not like, it's like what Ariel was saying earlier, like it's radical, but it's not, because we've been doing it. And then when building off your conversation about courts, I know we have like in criminal justice, GLADU reports, but I mean, that could really range from small minor offenses to those major ones, and looking at that family history of what made that individual do it. But like, there's a lot of residential school, Indian day school, all these impacts, intergenerational impacts that still are affecting us. And then we can't heal from that because we don't know how, or we don't even know what that first step is, or there's stigma on a family because of what has happened. And so that is carried out through the community, like, oh, that family is this, so you want to stay away from them. And then they're kind of ostracized out there and like, well, this is all I'm going to amount to be, so I might as well just do it. Right. So I feel like there's a lot of things at play. But I'm looking at the GLADU reports and learning more about it, and hearing that how history really impacts that individual, and it could lead into a life of crime and a life of substance abuse, because they never had those coping mechanism. And it all stems from healing, and colonization really did a number on our people, both in North and South America. Like when you look at the tenets of colonization, they were all there and they're all impacting us, and they're still alive and well in our communities today. And so one of the things too, when I think about our models of care and in healing, is like, I know in some of our court systems, we're using these healing circles, but we're also using healing circles in terms of recovery and healing yourself and healing your relationships. And it's like a lifetime of that healing journey that we're going to go on. Right. So again, it's just always coming back to those roots. And I always tell people, like, let's go back to the beginning. Where did this all start? Like, what made you whatever? I'm not a social worker by any means. I am just a really good listener. And so I'm always thinking about where it's coming from. But I always find that in my community on Manitoulin, and the other communities on Manitoulin, the First Nations, they're often, these programs are community led. What does the community need? I mean, we don't get it within that year. It is a year of advocating, applying for funding. And then it could be 10 years until we see that into fruition, because you got to find a space, you got to get the place, then you got to hire the workers, and you got to do this. So there's a whole system that's happening there before we can even help our own. So we do need people to heal and be on those healing journeys, so then they can come back and share their stories, or deter people from going into that lifestyle.
Yeah, just to even, but I mean, you've said so much there. I want to be able to address everything point by point, but just everything you said is just really resonating. Which I think that like when we start thinking kind of about what truly makes something culturally responsive and what truly makes something culturally tailored is this acknowledgement of trauma, is this understanding of trauma, both at the individual level, but also at the community level, right? So when we're thinking about how to best treat opioid use disorder or how to best help a community heal, there needs to be an acknowledgement that at the center of all of this is that this behavior is masking an experience, right? A shared experience. So there have been, I mean, there's a ton of great research coming out of like really bright Indigenous scholars. The Indigenous stress coping model is one of them that kind of outlines the relationship between stress and trauma, and then the cultural buffers that may prevent someone from having all these negative health behaviors, and then also the ways in which these cultural buffers can also like append some healing to an individual who has these negative health behaviors, right? So when I think about kind of the importance of culturally tailoring some form of treatment, it is just overall this acknowledgement that there is a shared experience among a group of people that needs to be addressed and healed and talked through, especially through talking circles or some sort of like group behavioral therapy, some sort of group acknowledgement of a trauma that they've experienced. And some people don't even have the language, I think, to talk about that effectively. And that really impedes the process of healing from an Indigenous standpoint, for sure.
Thank you, Ariel, for that. We have been talking about these Indigenous cultural practices, but what are the similarities within communities and thinking about culturally tailored approaches? I know we've talked about here in Canada, we have very diverse areas. We have the Inuit groups, and then we have Métis groups, and we have in First Nations. And First Nations in themselves are all very different, as you know, in the States as well, are all very different in geography and in needs. And so I'm just wondering, the balance approach, like how do we balance all of these similarities and these differences? Because I know Ariel had talked about the urban Indigenous people in New York, whereas we also talked about rural is different and First Nations are different. So how do we create these programs that are beneficial to Indigenous people?
Sure. So absolutely, as you're saying, Indigenous communities can't be considered a monolith. And of course, when we consider what's going to be most effective for some Indigenous people in their recovery, it's not going to be useful for everyone. So even between when we consider the experiences of two different nations or tribal groups, right, we can see big differences in particular in how colonialism or experiences of colonialism may have impacted either group, or what elements of nature can be considered spiritual or healing, or even how different community practices can affect whether individuals adopt certain types of harm reduction strategies, right? So even between two tribal groups or two nations, you can see huge differences, right? And then even further, as we were saying, so between two individuals who belong to the same nation, whether a person lives estranged from their community, maybe in an urban setting or in a different state entirely, that can also dictate the degree to which a culturally tailored approach can be effective for that person, right? So as we've been talking about, the diversity here can really impact how a culturally tailored approach should be developed, right? So I think, and what research also shows, is that the effectiveness of culturally tailored interventions really hinges on its ability to appropriately reflect the needs and values of that specific community, right? So just as a side note, I recently acted on a task force that helped revise a fairly outdated model of treatment. I'm not going to name it here, but it was in an effort to better integrate the experiences of Indigenous people who are in recovery. And it was with a few different leaders in substance use behaviors that were also Indigenous across both Canada and the US. And the conclusion that we kind of came to as a group is that there really needs to be an opportunity for the person who's administering this tool to identify and personalize the practices of the community that they're working with at like every possible juncture, right? So to not just make this specific to a particular tribe or nation, but to also make the treatment protocol as accessible to the people who are living in that environment, in that community, their whole life, right? So certain ceremonies, certain cultural practices, when they're referenced in the context of treatment, they need to be very personal, and they aren't isolating individuals who may feel estranged from that community as well. So there needs to just be an acknowledgement that each individual person is going to have a different relationship kind of to cultural practices. And there needs to be opportunities for people to personalize those experiences as much as possible as they're going through treatment. So one example that I'm thinking of, kind of back to urban Indigenous settings, right? So Native Americans for Community Action, it's an IHS facility based in Flagstaff, an urban Native center that's devoted to promoting many positive Indigenous health outcomes. And they have a really strong behavioral treatment arm that provides holistic services for Indigenous people in the area, and particularly people who are in recovery from opiates. So the way that they kind of conceptualize this culturally tailored treatment is that they have elders that are on contract from a number of Native nations in town, that can provide counseling and ceremony that is specific to the practices of the individual who's going through treatment. They also have regular talking circles, which is something that can kind of, it's more of a pan or a trans Indigenous practice that many people can identify with at once. And even though Dene folks are the ones that are very well represented in this community, I think it's around 60% of the clientele are Dene. There's still an acknowledgement that there are other Indigenous people who have come from other areas of Arizona, who also need treatment services. So making sure that the nations of those people are represented and the elders that are on contract, making sure that the practices aren't just specific to Dene people, and really reflecting the diversity of experiences that urban Indigenous folks have in this community here in Flagstaff makes it especially sustainable and effective as well. So I think just the identity of the people who are actively participating in treatment are appropriately reflected in the efforts of a particular community. Ariel, do you have anything else you'd want to add to that?
I mean, everything you say is always perfect. You know, I love that. I'm your ultimate fangirl. But this was making me think of distribution of resources, who has access to working with different, again, I'm gonna come from like an academic point, that, you know, I've seen there's several universities that have centers for Indigenous or Native American health, and I deeply respect a lot of the work that they do. And often because of resources and just being able to make connections, you will see some interventions that are focused on one community or one or two communities or in just one geographic area, which is wonderful. But that leaves out, if someone else comes in and thinks, oh, okay, oh, there's this culturally tailored program, it's for Indigenous people, not acknowledging, understanding, recognizing that this program was made for Dene people, with them in mind, which is wonderful, and that should be, but it shouldn't just be transported, taken into some other community, because, you know, there's over 576 federally recognized tribes in the US, not to count state recognized and unrecognized, and then the global Indigenous people who are living there. So you're not going to be able to address everybody with one that is focused in one specific, you know, geographic area. But that really comes from who is making those decisions and implementing it. So if we come back kind of to like a policy level, that if you have people who are connected in whatever community, wherever you are, saying, hey, we need to do this. If you have an Indigenous person there who is representative of the people around them, that's going to be top of mind for them instead of some other politician or city governance person saying, oh, I read this has great outcomes. I saw a native thing, or I saw an indigenous thing. We'll just import that here. So kind of coming back to our policy recommendations, and honestly, people having a seat at the table from the very beginning, because we wouldn't let that happen. And that's something that I have to consider as we are building out programming. And, we're at Urban Indigenous Collective, we're starting to get into more group-based services, and then we'll be able to get into direct services. So I'm honestly just building this from the ground up. And all of that started with a community health needs assessment, sitting in community at Indigenous Peoples Day 2019, came in hand with paper surveys. I love telling the story. It makes me so happy because, all of us founders, we are all Indigenous from a multitude of identities, from, state recognized to federally recognized to descendant to me being from South America, or descendant of people from South America. And it was, like my first year of the PhD program. I know if you're thinking of starting a social organization, maybe don't do it while you are also trying to pursue a PhD. It is a lot of work, but being connected and in community is what kept me going. It is what kept me through all of the really, really hard, frustrating, scary times, was knowing that I was going to be part of this new group of Indigenous scholars who are doing work in our own communities with people who look like me, people who I have bonds to, that are beyond, that is not just a people, like what is your population of interest, but it is like, these are my friends, these are my family. And that is that extra connection and burden and responsibility, and honestly kinship. So back to Indigenous Peoples Day was our first event. We knew that we're not originally from New York City. We needed to do things in a good way, let people know who we are. We're just a new nonprofit that had like zero funding. It was basically our co-founder, Sutton King's mom, who funded us for our first initial things. And I had designed a survey, and I knew, I'm like, okay, well, if this internet goes down, we'll also bring paper copies. But we had iPads, we had all of these ways to make it easy and efficient, and all of these academic ways to make things go fast. But we'd also set up a pop-up tent. We had pillows, we had chairs, we had tables, we had crafts and activities for the kids. And a survey, because with all good surveys, you're supposed to let the people know how long it may take. People were sitting down, taking this for like 15, 20 minutes, wanting to write out their answers, talk about what their concerns were as an Indigenous person living in a city. What were their mental health concerns? What were their physical health concerns? What types of programming did they want to see? All full well knowing that we didn't have any funding yet, that we were just 4 Indigenous students trying to do something. And this one elder said, this is the first time anybody's really listened to what I wanted to say. And that always, oh my God, I'm gonna cry. It sticks with me, because I knew that it was confirmation that we started things, and that we were moving in a good direction. And now, almost 4 years later, we have like a staff of 4. We have several public health and social work students that we work with, again, that is supporting that training from the very beginning. So again, this sounds like an aside, but it really comes back to, how are you doing program planning? How are you doing evaluation? How are you planning to work with and in community? And I'm so excited that we are hosting 3 Indigenous social work students from Columbia University this coming fall. When I did my master's there was 1 other Indigenous, maybe 2 other Indigenous students, and now we have like Native graduation. So it is changing, and it's exciting that we're going to be having these Indigenous practitioners be able to step into jobs. They can either, be in like rural or reservation-based communities, or they can be in city settings. And when an Indigenous person comes in there, there's going to be an Indigenous practitioner, an Indigenous social worker, therapist, someone who can, understand and meet those needs.
So it really starts from, you got to go way back. It's got to start from the initial planning of the programming, and that's the space that we're in right now.
If you don't mind me building off of this, I mean, God, yeah. Talk about ultimate fangirl. I feel like the Ariel's relationship is just based in, there have been several times where Ariel has written something and I've read it and I say, I want to get that tattooed on my body. So basically I'm going to have an entire sleeve of just things that Ariel has either written or said. And I just get to look at it whenever I want to. But anyway, that was really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And so, again, I don't want to jump the gun with this, but this is just making me think about what I see the biggest differences are between like the community-based work and the work with community partners and the work that really kind of drives the community engagement and the soul work that we do versus kind of the things that we have to do as academics for our job. I see, for the most part, with the academics that I know, people come in with a research question and they come in with an idea, and then they kind of backtrack from that idea to like go back through the literature, see what other people have studied about it, see what other people have written about, and then kind of conceptualize an idea based off of the research question and the literature review that they did, and kind of move knowledge forward that way. When I think as Indigenous people and people who have experience with like working with Indigenous folks on the ground, we know that like our knowledge is rooted in our ancestral history. It's rooted in what the people before us have always known, right? And so instead of kind of coming at questions or problems from this idea of like, oh, I have a unique original thought that no one's ever had before, here, let me like do some research on things other people have written about and learn that way. We know that isn't a sustainable way of knowledge generation, right? It's about creating community. It's about finding ways to integrate the ideas and the understandings and the teachings of the people before us and moving forward using the knowledge base that the generations before us have already gathered, right? And so I think when I think of all of the things I would love to address about academia, I mean, the core issue here is that instead of, publishing for the sake of publishing or generating knowledge for the sake of getting tenure, instead it's about building upon kind of this legacy of what other folks have learned and taught us, and moving things forward directly that way, instead of, trying to create the most original idea that has ever been had and like trying to like build this gap around what we don't know, instead of kind of building from what we do. So anyway, that whole story that you gave, Ariel, was just so uplifting. And I think it really speaks to the ways that we could really improve academic practices and improve the way that we treat Indigenous systems of knowledge, because they're so important and they're so integral to knowledge generation and the way that we can learn more about the world moving forward.
Thank you, Ariel and Ariel. You both touch on some really interesting points I've been thinking about lately, and currently in the process of writing a paper on homogenating our groups together, which is very frustrating because I think there should be some type of adaptable framework for us. Like, I know you were talking about the Dene people, but I was also thinking too that as an Anishinaabe, I often, like, I know my protocols when I'm here, but I also know when I step into Haudenosaunee territory, I'm a guest. And that immediately, whatever your protocols are, out of respect for me being on your territory, I'm in your ways of being, doing, and knowing now, I'm going to follow your ways of being and doing and knowing, because I feel like that is the respectful thing. So when we talk about like, we're trying to be inclusive and this whole EDI is coming out, and which is great to a certain extent, but then you're homogenizing us and then you're trying to be inclusive, but you can't be inclusive because we're so different, right? And we all have different needs. And I feel like this is a theme, but also when you were talking about that, like if I was down in New York, and I would immediately respect, this is just my perspective though, I would adapt myself to the protocols and traditions of the people living there, right? I wouldn't be demanding, where's my tobacco? Where's my sweetgrass? Where's my sage? Because I know that may not be the medicines that grew traditionally in that area. So they may have different medicines that are used. And so I think that having adaptable frameworks that, like, yes, this is what they use, and then just applying my own skills. And I know some of our people are not in that space yet, so they'll just kind of go with it or grow with it until like they learn who they are, and that healing journey, right? So that is some of the things I think of, like, when I'm thinking of, like, I feel like practices cannot be just fully adapted to include everybody. Sometimes it has to be specifically built for a particular nation. And when you were talking about that, Ariel, about for the Dene people, I was like, yeah, like if I were a guest there, I would totally follow everything that's being done, because I feel like it's a respectful and an honorable way to do and learn and grow with that nation while I'm pursuing my own healing journey. That is just a thought that both of you had triggered or activated within me, where I was like, I need to just really sit with this for a minute and think about this. Sometimes it's okay. I don't want to put into the thoughts of other people, but maybe just focusing on the person's traditional land that you're currently occupying, and then maybe having some type of adaptable framework that could be applied to them.
Do you mind if I'm just going to say something very quickly? I love that thought very much. And what I found as a person who was not brought up in the traditional teachings of, especially like Indigenous studies, right? My background has been kind of very, devastatingly colonial, frankly. I have an economics background, which was painful. I have a mathematics background, which I think actually is very Indigenous, but the way it's taught isn't necessarily so. But I remember attending my first lectures of Indigenous scholars at the University of Utah, where I was working before I moved here. There was a scholar who talked about this idea of trans-indigeneity, right? Instead of just pan-indigeneity, meaning like we're trying to find what the commonality between all Indigenous people. It's this idea of bringing certain elements of Indigenous culture from one area to a new area to kind of see where like these cultures can kind of add to each other and how they can kind of uplift. So it was a man who was raised in Maori tradition, who learned a lot about building canoes in the Maori tradition, and then moved to an Ojibwe nation, and started like comparing and showing kind of the differences in the way that water and canoes and like movement are treated across those cultures. And it was just so cool to think of it as like we're generating kind of knowledge outside of the context of, like this like white Western traditional framework of like learning, right? And it was just so cool to me to see like how, essentially like being treated both as a guest on the land, but also as someone who's bringing new pieces of information that could be useful. It was just very kind of cool to see the interaction between those two ideas of both being a guest, but also being a purveyor of knowledge and wisdom, and how everyone kind of benefited from that. So anyway, I just wanted to add, because I think that's it's an awesome way to think about how cultures can kind of benefit each other and kind of see both the similarities and the differences, and how that can kind of grow Indigenous knowledge systems that way.
That just made me very excited to hear like growth of Indigenous knowledge systems because of settler colonialism. God, I feel like we need to count how many times I've mentioned that today, or how many times that's been mentioned in this conversation. But it understandably so, many of our communities are trying to go back to and save traditions of the past. But I love to imagine a future that if we weren't constantly responding, trying to save, trying to go back, we would have already been communicating with other communities. We would have already been connecting with other Indigenous nations and learning and growing. Like we're still here. We were never supposed to stay in history in the behind times. It was always going to be moving forward. But because of this trauma, it is like trying to get back to this. But I love imagining Indigenous futures that come from Indigenous histories. And of course, I deeply respect traditions and histories. And then I think of how communities have looked at where they are and then said, this is no longer working for us. We need to change because of what is happening and support our people in a different way. And just reminds me of this, I'm forgetting exactly which community, but it was around lacrosse, and some of the clan mothers came together because, you know, traditionally wasn't for the girls to play. It was the men's sport, and a long history around that and why, and I understand why. And then in response to an epidemic of youth suicide, we're like, the girls want to play this game. The girls see this as healing. And they said, this is now a practice that the girls should be playing, that the feminine energy should be playing. And it totally changed for that community. I just thought that was so beautiful that, you know, there's like coming in and changing and adapting. And that's why I always say that, you know, Indigenous people have always been scientists. We've always been experts in our land, our culture, our plants, the animals, the systems, what's around us. I mean, we wouldn't still be here if we weren't analytical, if we didn't have rigor. So I'm often fighting against this. So often I will talk about Indigenous research methods, and people kind of get this glossy look and think, oh, it's this mystical research way. And I'm like, no, it's just honoring your ways, and it's very relational based. And then they're like, oh wow, it sounds like a lot like qualitative. I'm like, because it is. It's not this like mystical Indian persona that's this whole other way. It's just anti-colonial. So I'm really trying to push that. So, and I could speak all day on this. This is such an amazing conversation. I'm so excited to be in this virtual space with you, with all of you.
That might actually be a great segue, because you both straddle academic and community engagement spaces with these topics, and probably often have to explain your research in community spaces and explain your community engagement work in academic spaces. Could you touch on how your approaches converge or differ in these different spaces, and what can be learned from bridging what is often a pretty significant gap between the two? Have you been able to bridge that gap to some extent? It's a big thing to ask of two young researchers, but I think it's something of interest to a lot of people who are trying to straddle both spaces.
I think for me, you know, I started getting involved in community organizing when I was living in DC around the Dakota Access Pipeline and No DAPL and Indigenous water rights. So, and I think I mentioned a little earlier that, you know, being connected to community is what's kept me going, what's even allowed me to just finish this 5-year program. And all along the way, actually recently I was reading my personal statement when I applied to the PhD program, which I was afraid was going to be very cringeworthy, but it was nice to go back and compare and see what was I interested in. Why did I get into this? I think it was like maybe year 3. Like, how did I end up here? This is way too much. And even back then, I was talking about dissemination of research, making sure that it was accessible at all levels. And I think that is the thing that ties together my academic work with my community work with my academic work, is that I want my parents to be able to read what I write and understand it. Maybe it doesn't have to be all like the quantitative aspects, but they should be able to understand 80% of it. It shouldn't be this overly confusing thing to read, which a lot of academics do. They write in the passive voice, and it's just so hard to connect with. I often go on little mini rants when I teach, and I tell students, like, if you read that 3 or 4 times and you're just not getting it, maybe it's just poorly written. It's not you. You're not inherently uneducated or not able to understand it. So when I think about how I share the work that I do, of course, I understand that I have decided to be in academia, that I do have to publish in academic journals, but I want to go beyond that. So even this podcast, I see this as a different way of disseminating my research, because I really did summarize a lot of 2 of the papers that Ariel and I worked on. And this is just a more accessible, or a different accessibility to the work that we do. Other forms that we have, that I've shared work, is social media campaigns, social media posts, a mural So there's so many different ways that we can bridge this together, and it's not as like hard or illustrious or scary as it may sound. Or maybe I've just worked my way through it. I mean, this is 5 years in, more like 10 years in. So I have kind of worked through those kinks. And even in my interview, my job talk at the U, at University of Utah, I said in the beginning of my talk, I said, you are specifically asking for a community-based researcher who has experience with Indigenous communities. So I'm going to present to you half of this on my dissertation, and the other half is going to be on my community work. It's not going to focus on how many outcomes or how many academic journals I've published in. It's going to talk about this very on the ground work that takes longer, that has hiccups, that has longer timelines to it. So that's my very, very long answer. Oh, actually, I do have one more part. The way that we, the way that we do this at Urban Indigenous Collective, and I think that is, Urban Indigenous Collective was also this dream for me that I could maybe see a life outside of academia, or expand the reaches of what academia means and how I can engage with it and exist in this world. So in addition to being a co-director and co-founder, I also guide the research agenda, because I'm like the data nerd there, and practices. And we always talk about community-based participatory research that is basically just in partnership with our community members, with our kin. And there's 4 things that we really focus on consultation, continuous consent, co-creation, and data sovereignty. And as long as we are thinking about those things throughout, again, from the ideation, the beginning of whatever research we're engaging in, to all the way the end of how we are sharing the information, that's how we know that we are doing things well and that we're kind of bridging that together. I also like trying to explain, not a glossary, but using more technical terms and then explaining it to people, because it shouldn't, I don't want research to be this scary, intangible thing. So I sometimes will throw in words that are very different, but then I explain them immediately. It's not hard to do that. It's not hard to make things accessible. But then also things that I think that are ridiculously overly complicated, I will just publish that way. So I also want to change what is out there in the academic space, and just I would like to get to where I have one voice, or that's more in the middle, that goes across both. And eventually I hope that we can have an institutional review board through Urban Indigenous Collective that we can train community members to understand and engage with research and say, nope, that doesn't work for us. And that they have that affirmed voice. So, they've always had a voice, but now they have an actual structure to approve research that happens within an urban context. So that's what I'm excited for.
So kind of working off that, I will admit that it is, we've both been graduate students for a long time. And I think we've both been engaging in community-based work for, 5 years, is probably longer for Ariel, but for me, it's been around 5 years. So I guess I don't want to mislead anyone into thinking that I am the ultimate expert on how to bridge this like very fine gap. But as I project forward and I think more about the career and the legacy that I want to have in my work, I certainly think that what needs to happen in academic spaces is that there needs to be more representation of Indigenous thought and Indigenous ideas. And that's just kind of where things need to head in order for, I think, the academy to truly exist in a way that it pretends to exist now, right? So I see like my position and my like career as a vessel for the community members and the change that I want to make, kind of as a way for those thoughts and ideas to kind of be projected into these spaces, right? The work that I do that really fills my soul is the community-based work. It's the work with Indigenous groups. But I know that when I look at my CV, right, when I look at kind of what things are going to grant me promotion. So much of what I do and love and spend the most energy like thinking about isn't reflected on that page, right? Like the things that people see immediately are the academic publications, which for anyone who's done Indigenous work knows that like inherently that stuff takes longer because it should, right? Because of the misgivings of research on Indigenous groups generally. There are so many more there are just so many more barriers put into place to protect Indigenous people, because there's just been such a history of researchers using Indigenous communities and like essentially perpetuating settler colonialism through research, right? And so I find myself often really having to grapple with like how do I both kind of keep my career alive and make it so that like I can continue to like act as a vehicle for like Indigenous thought and Indigenous representation while still kind of like be like staying afloat, right? So I'm gonna say that I don't quite know how to strike that balance yet. I feel often like a lot of the work that I do isn't well recognized, or at least the stuff I spend the most time doing isn't well recognized in my job. But also I know the thing is for academics, you really have to find yourself in career pathways that understand the importance of that type of work, right? So I think Ariel has landed in a great position at the University of Utah in the School of Social Work that really values community-based work. And I know that at Northern Arizona University, where I am now, there are entire centers devoted to Indigenous work, Indigenous thought, and community-based work with Indigenous populations, right? So it's really about finding kind of that perfect balance of like, how am I filling my soul? How am I doing the work that I want to do? But also, how am I going to continue in this career path while still, you know, maintaining the level of excellence that I need in order to be there, right? So I'm not convinced this fully answers your question, but I think to some degree it's a work in progress, and I'm hopeful that the more I think the more representation that we see in academic spaces with Indigenous people, I think the more it's going to start to be recognized, kind of the importance of that contribution, and hopefully standards for tenure or standards, you know, for excellence in the work will adjust to kind of encapsulate that as we continue to represent ourselves. But it is just kind of, it's often a tricky spot to be in.
I just wanted to add that it made it sound like I have a balance in life. I am working constantly, so I am actually trying to figure that out as a new faculty member, and things are going to shift over the next year for me. So I don't want anyone listening who's thinking, oh, I can start a grad program, I can start a new job and start an organization, hire people, manage 6 interns. I don't suggest doing that because it's really tough, and it has been very hard, but it is very rewarding. So I am going to have to figure out, because I am also trying to get away from grind culture, from capitalism, from not sleeping, from all these things. So I don't want to be this person who says it's all possible if you can just try it, because I think that's a lie, especially to women or you know, feminine folks who are in these who are in these spaces, especially academia. Like PhD is basically meant for men who have a wife at home to take care of all of the other things that are happening while we have all of our community, family, personal responsibilities that we are still doing on top of it, and then still showing up at work and trying to get tenure. So I would be remiss if I didn't say that and just put out this picture that I'm doing it. If Eric can do it, anyone can do it. Absolutely not. I don't agree with that at all.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, because, you know, there is this hustle culture that's out there, which I think when you're doing a graduate program, yes, you do have to hustle to a certain extent, but you don't want to burn yourself out. A lot of things too, that as Indigenous people, that we do a lot of emotional labor, and because we're centering communities at the front and center of all of the work that we're doing, we're trying to create these slivers of appropriate research. And then we got to think of communities and then individual impacts. And it is really this balance of uplifting our people while humbling non-Indigenous people. So there is a lot of emotional labor that we're doing that's so taxing. And so taking care of yourself is so important, and really focusing in on that. But right now, I think I want to thank both you, Ariel and Ariel, for your thoughtful and informative insights on the opioid crisis and, the impacts on Indigenous communities and, those intervention frameworks and representations that meet the needs for Indigenous peoples and communities in colonial spaces. And when it comes to opioid crisis, that Indigenous communities are still being impacted by colonialism. So there is still a lot of work that we got to do. And I know we are all working collectively to heal our communities in different capacities. So I want to thank you both, and Daniel too, for being part of Aanoodizewin podcast and sharing your knowledge and experiences with our listeners.
Miigwech.
Thank you so much for having us and inviting us and extending it to both of us. I think that really honors the way in which we work. We do things in pairs. It's the first thing I thought of was to invite Ariel in.
Yeah, Amy, and I'm just so stoked on the work that you're doing, and I cannot wait to follow all of the cool stuff that you do. And hopefully one day we will all work together in case you ever need, a couple of Ariels to to work with. We're your girls. So anytime, just let us know.
Perfect. I love it. Networking through a podcast. Absolutely. Miigwech.
This podcast is produced by Defining Moments Canada for the Bryce 100 Project, which commemorates Dr. Peter Bryce's 1922 pamphlet and his role in bringing to public attention the atrocious health conditions for Indigenous children in residential schools. In exploring the commercial determinants of health and their impacts for and on Indigenous peoples, we continue to bring public attention to the factors that impact Indigenous health.